Greetings, friends. You are on the Military Reports channel. And today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on the 18th of April, 2024 year. A lot of things have happened today, so let's get started. Before we start discussing the situation on the line of contact with you, of course, it is worth noting, probably very important news, that comes to us from the European Union, the United States of America. To be more precise, over the past few days, several days, weeks, 3 factories for the production of 155mm shells for the APU have been exposed to no one possibly. Fires have occurred, explosions have occurred at these plants, that is, -3 plants. Well, for sure, the damage is certainly not critical. For sure it will be possible to either have already been restored, or it will be possible to restore these plants in the near future. But in general, we can note that 3 factories for the production of 155mm, say, shells for Ukraine have been exposed to no one there. At the same time, it is worth noting that there is an extremely high probability that NATO and EU countries are trying to reduce the cost of production. Perhaps in this regard, either low-quality materials or low-quality labor are used, which in general lead to the fact that we see 3 factories were damaged to some extent. This is noted, of course, all over the world, and at the same time, individual sources say that it is possible that this is the trace and/or the hand of the work of Russian saboteurs. Well, let's see. In the end, sooner or later, it will become more or less clear to us. Germany also announced, or rather the manufacturer of the ARIST system announced, that in the near future, Ukraine will receive several more systems, at least one air defense system. Well, let's watch. Next, let's move on with you to the situation on Earth. Of the interesting things, I would like to look at the cards published by the armed forces of Ukraine. In these frames, you can watch with you the attacks of the attack systems on the Crimea, on the Jankoy airfield. Let me remind you that just yesterday we discussed this blow, or rather its consequences. Ukrainian sources report that during the strike, several S-300 systems were destroyed, but so far, no geolocations or frames confirming the damage have been published. Next, let's start from the Kharkiv direction, or rather continue. The armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to sweep the Kharkiv region. FABs are being struck at the locations of the concentration of the armed forces of Ukraine. While the operation, officially the operation on the offensive on Kharkov, has not begun. Kupiansky direction. There are no changes in the northern Kupiansky direction. There, let's say it's a small counter-battery struggle, but it's worth noting a certain intensification of hostilities, let's say in the central Kupiansky direction. This is between the locality of Borovaya and the localities of Stilmahovki, Sazarevka. That is, say, the tip, the north of the Stalin River. There are published shots of Lancet strikes on positions on the equipment of the armed forces of Ukraine. Published shots of strikes on positions in Ukraine with the use of artillery, and in my opinion, there are also ARBC 500 flew in, but in general some kind of cleaning is being carried out, including published shots of strikes on the locality of Borovaya. This is, let's say, the main location of the armed forces of Ukraine, at some distance, let's say, the last stronghold of the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine in this direction. That is, well, it's not the last one yet. There are still many, many things ahead, but in general, headquarters are located here. The main concentration of forces, some warehouses are located here. And today, one of the districts of the city was struck. Let's say the South Kupiansky direction. Another attempt of the offensive by the armed forces of the Russian Federation in the direction of Kamal-in-Turnum. Again, it was not quite possible to conduct a successful offensive during the attack. Massive strikes were carried out on positions, equipment and personnel of the Russian army with the use of drones in Beer. A large number of vehicles were damaged or destroyed. In other words, we see with you the route where the attack approximately began on the positions, on the equipment of the Russian army, and approximately where they managed to reach. In other words, in general, here, if we turn again, There are several such tactical directions as it is possible to advance on the offensive. For example, in the area of the Tik, this is one offensive. In the area of the Pike, this is the second offensive. And in the area of the Mittens, this is a possible third direction of attack. The last day of the offensive was mainly carried out in the area of, let's say, Pike, and in the area of pincers. But all the attacks were fought off by thorns. These days, the Russian army tried to advance along the Mitten-Ziampollovka line. Here I am a mitten, because here is a forest in the form of a small mitten. Just as apparently she was drowned and failed to achieve much success. Then we are moving with you to the Seversk direction, where the armed forces of the Russian Federation are continuing their assault actions towards Belogorovka. Today, the Russian army, over the past few days of the day, has managed to slightly improve its position, precisely at the base of the chalk dump, to come as close as possible to the industrial zone. In these frames, we see assault actions with you, as the Russian army is storming, climbing a small hill, with a small detachment of 234 attack aircraft, but in general this activity is there, but very, very slowly. If it is possible to mark progress on certain sections of the front, let's say from 50 to 100 meters there. Then if we talk about Belogorovka, a possible advance per week can be 10 to 15 meters at most. 4 days in a row, the armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to sweep the AFU positions in the area along the railway, in the direction of Vyemskaya. Railway station Vyemka. Apparently, there is a fairly dense and very massive shelling with you. In other words, preparatory work is still underway. No one will tell you how long this preparatory work will be carried out now. Now the Seversk direction is, of course, the key one, and here Ukraine understands the risks. So it does not spare personnel or reserves, they are being transferred here in large numbers. So they constantly have to fire, shoot. Drones, Lancets, artillery, toss, Rubishki, aerial bombs. Rushing, flying here and to the place, let's say, one of the personnel enters the other from the side of the APU. And everything in a new circle. It is difficult to say how long such strikes will continue to be carried, but sooner or later resources and reserves may run out. Although today it was reported that for the month of March, Jesus could, let's say, mobilize around 60,000 people in quotation marks. And it is reported that for April the plan costs 120,000. Well, let's see. Razdalovka is a similar situation. It is worth raising the number of updates from the first number. We can see how closely they are working in this direction as well. Drones regularly fly here, the APU regularly rotates. The Russian army is constantly trying to track or find the next concentration of force. These shots show how a canteen was discovered, food was delivered, an attempt was made to unload possibly food somewhere in this area. However, this could not be done, and the Russian army as a whole destroyed both the process of, let's say, unloading, including then a small car or a trailer with food there. Then we are moving with you to the Chasky direction. There are no changes here. The armed forces of the Russian Federation, continuing their assault actions towards, let's say, the eastern outskirts of the canal, are storming Bogdanovka as well. A large number of frames and geolocation have been published along, let's say, the road, along, let's say, the Bogdanovka-Kalinovka line. In these frames, we can observe with you the strikes with the use of drones. A large number of strikes on personnel, on equipment. In other words, approximately we can understand exactly how the Russian army will continue to advance in this direction. In general, it is clear how the sweep takes place. In general, strikes should be expected there, and accordingly. Perhaps in the near future, the Russian army will be able to move in this direction, and we will be able to paint, say, this area in the color of the control of the Russian army. Perhaps it will happen even before the end of this week. Artillery strikes are also being carried out on northern Kalinovka. The APU regularly tries to transfer someone, throw something. But all this is monitored and, of course, destroyed by an artillery strike, artillery fire. According to the Eastern Watch, there is no news, no updates. It is difficult to understand how the Russian fighters managed to gain a foothold. They failed to gain a foothold. But the only thing we can say for sure is that footage of Russian drones flying in and clearing the area comes from here every day. So far, as we can see for ourselves, most likely there is no active phase on Earth yet. There will be, for now, exactly an attempt to sweep at a remote distance. Then we are moving to the Kleshayev direction. The armed forces of the Russian Federation have become very active in this area. Perhaps, while there is a sweep and suppression of the position in the eastern direction in the Yar, there is time, there are some resources that the command of the Russian army wants to use on the battlefield, so while there is some kind of operational pause, while the gunners are working in the operator's beer, aviation, assault operations begin, and active combat operations are conducted on the direction of Kleshivka. If we increase the number of updates with you since the beginning of the month, then in general, we also understand the focus and work very closely, that is, the cleanup is underway. Here it is also worth expecting in the near future an attempt to attack and an attempt to organize an operation on the ground. In order to squeeze out these positions in Jesus, the final sweep of the Andriivka, Kleshivka, Ivanevskaya bridgehead. Also, the Russian army regularly conducts, let's say, a counter-battery struggle. Over the past few days, another batch of artillery installations of the armed forces of Ukraine has been destroyed during the counter-battery struggle. In other words, everything is quite efficient, and all the work is carried out according to some plan, according to the planned course. Then we are moving with you to the Avdiivka direction, to the direction where everything looks very bad. It seems that everything is very bad for the armed forces of Ukraine. Let me remind you that this is no longer a secret. Everyone absolutely agrees on this. Everyone understands it perfectly. Due to the incomprehensible behavior of the 115th Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine in this direction, the front practically collapsed, and it is even difficult to assume whether the armed forces of Ukraine managed to stabilize it or failed. So far, based on the geolocations that we receive, we can make an unambiguous conclusion that it has not been possible to stabilize the front line so far. Let's say the news came in the morning that the Russian army managed to enter, let's say, the southeastern outskirts of Osheretyn, go in, take control of a separate building, then later footage of the presence itself began to be published. Not just some cartographers, but already specific frames. Here, let's say we can observe Osheretino itself, artillery strikes on Russian fighters, attempts to advance and fighters entering the first streets of the settlement. Then even later there during the day, somewhere in the middle of the day, the last shots were received from the Ukrainian side. Here they just geolocated themselves, they show themselves and pay attention. It turns out to be a station, let's say a filtration station. Perhaps an electrical substation in the area of the settlement. We see the first soldier who leaves the area, and after him, one by one, the Russian fighters begin to leave in large numbers. The industrial zone in the area of the settlement of Chesno. A large number, some of them, let's say, amateurs, counted up to 50 personnel. In other words, we can now assume in what sizes and with what scope, the Russian army is advancing. That here are 50 people just leaving the area. But the Ukrainians immediately picked up the video and reported that they were retreating under blows, under weight. Well, like everything, the offensive has choked, they begin to run away. This is the Ukrainian version. Russian sources report that regrouping is being carried out, that they have retreated to more advantageous positions. I think that both one and the second country are absolutely right here. Please note that in some small building, perhaps 200 square meters, perhaps 400 square meters, there were up to 50 soldiers of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. One arrival of a J-lady, and well, as if there were not several platoons, yes. Therefore, naturally, no one was here to collect and keep, was not going to. Perhaps they really managed to develop some kind of offensive, but then, after all, when the whole story surfaced, And the Ukrainian team realized in it at all, and it dawned on them what was going on and how all this was happening in general. Perhaps it was possible to transfer some separate units here. Perhaps someone came to replace the 3rd Brigade. Perhaps the 115th separate battalions rolled up, which began to hold the front line more or less well. And after that the Russian army realized that there was no point in advancing further. It's just going to be a suicide operation. We managed to gain a foothold. Perhaps they left several platoons there, perhaps with the aim of stabilizing, controlling, and already entrenching themselves, and preventing a counter-offensive there. Perhaps it came up. It is possible that those who retreated, it may have been an assault group, perhaps a moment before the assault group. A reinforcement group came, and just a rotation took place. The stormtroopers rolled back, and the fixers remained fixed. In other words, it is difficult to say, and we will not draw unambiguous conclusions. The only thing we have is a specific promotion, a specific entry into locality. The fighting continues. Now it is possible that a reinforcement group has entered. The attack aircraft have rolled back. Now they will try to consolidate themselves in order to hold positions as long as possible, while the Russian artillery, aviation in the front, will equalize the line with the ground until another, let's say, window of opportunity for further offensive appears. But until the window of opportunity opens, until the Russian army levels the front line. And by leveling the front line first of all, of course, we are talking about the complete collapse of Berdik. And, of course, Novobakhmutovka. Only if there are 2 of these settlements under the control of the Russian army does it make sense, the possibility and, well, in general, it makes sense, the possibility of a further attack on the next one. Without control over Novobakhmutovka and Berdik any further attack on the Q will be accompanied by heavy losses, not even during the offensive of the battles for the Q, but during the transfer of personnel, even along the line of, say, that steppe, well, let's say this area. Just destroy everything with drones, mortars, and everything that can fly, shoot, explode. That is, there is no further, and they have gained a foothold. Good result. Now it is necessary to expand the bridgehead of Bakhmutev, Kabardachi. It is possible to press in the direction of Novo-Kalinov-Karamik. In general, ideally, on the part of the Russian army, it is still possible to get as close as possible. To cut the first torpish of the poison street, that is, to expand the bridgehead. Having already expanded the bridgehead, please, we can go further in the next one. And in general, everyone understands this perfectly well. This is directly what is happening now. At the same time, pay attention to how quickly it was possible to get into this country village. There is also a mopping up of the anchorage. That is, I understand that the result was achieved. It is simply impossible to describe in words now the expansion of the bridgehead and consolidation. And further, according to separate sources, let's say the same deep state about the Ukrainian cartographers of the Russian army, managed to take control of the data network of support points, say, located north of the Dacha village. The information is confirmed by both pro-Ukrainian and neutral cartographers, including today, the first shots from the settlement of Novokalinov itself began to be published. At first, it was also some kind of updates from the pro-Ukrainian deep state cartographers showing the advance of the Russian army. But after that, Ukrainian sources published footage of artillery strikes on a building in the center of the settlement. And, as the author of this video claims, that the strikes are being carried out on. An artillery strike and a mortar strike were inflicted on the positions of the Russian army. That is, well, based on those geolocations, all cartographers in general have updated the maps, and now you see what we see. And the situation is extremely sad. The first line of defense of Pristina and Novokalinov has been breached. The main strongholds and strongholds along the perimeter of the settlement are under the control of the Russian army. Now there is such a mega stronghold, a company stronghold between Novokalinova and Serestina. This is what it will be difficult for the Russian army to overcome it now, and it will probably try to bypass it, but either at least come close to it. Well, then everything seems to be according to plan. As if there is a plan, there is already experience, and I don't think that for a very long time in the future, they will be able to resist here. But again, I repeat, after the trouble of the new Bakhmutovka, He understands the importance of Burdik. So they cling to Burdik with the last of their strength. Today, the Russian army is here again. He shows footage of the sun strikes on the central part, which once again confirms and shows that this part of the settlement is under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. And now it will be the main focus here. We need to level the front, then move on. Umanskaya, Yasnobrodovka, Pervomaiskaya. The armed forces of the Russian Federation have made several attempts to attack in order to cut the highway. But all attempts have not yet ended in success. There are still forces and reserves to bomb with artillery strikes, cassettes, and in general, the situation is not changing yet. While there is complete silence, no information comes from the artillery pocket between Pervomaisky and non-military. There is no information. The Russian army managed to finally clean up, failed, negotiations are underway, or the APU is holding on from the last to enter the points without retreating. But the APU does not undertake any counterstrikes with the aim of unblocking possibly stuck fighters in this area. The counter-battery struggle continues successfully. Over the past day, another batch of artillery installations of the armed forces of Ukraine has been destroyed during counterattacks and strikes of Krasnopol. Then we are moving with you to the Krasnogorsk direction. As you can see, there is a large number of geolocations. Here, if you increase geolocation from the 1st of April, then we see just such a picture and rarely meet anywhere. The most important thing that is worth paying attention to is the approximate parity in geolocation of 80-90% by 10. Perhaps 85 by 15, but in general it confirms and speaks not only about the complete dominance of the Russian army in full superiority in all types of weapons in the direction, but also in general. It seems to say that the APU does not offer any resistance. And this is a big question. For whatever reason, there is no resistance. Some drones are flying, not some cassettes are flying, but in general, and as if this is not what it was worth. Let's say that we expected to see during the battle for the largest, most important key stronghold of the armed forces of Ukraine. The fortress, the last fortress in the Donetsk direction of the country of the armed forces of Ukraine. According to, I repeat, according to the latest Lenten cartographers, the Russian army has already established full control over the southern part, approximately 20% of the central part, during the fighting. Well, for sure in the near future, the Russian army will be engaged in cleaning up the forest belts located to the south. Here we see with you this field between the rate of the dry beam, Jubilee rates. Here is north of Georgiivka, north of the Mark, Tipol. There are still many APU fighters here, there are strong points. This support is still under the control of the APU. Surely, after cleaning up the southern part, the Russian army is now concentrating maximum attention on farms located on the southwestern outskirts, and after taking control of farms as a whole. The process of collapsing the positions of the APU will begin in these fields, and the final cleanup will be carried out. And after this final sweep, it is obvious that the Russian army will begin, and, in addition to the offensive on Krasnogorovka, the offensive on Georgiivka itself will begin with a wide front over the overhanging positions directly on the central one. And, in general, the slamming of the bridgehead in the forest in Georgiivka is also not far off. Here's what we painted white, it's already in principle, the days are numbered. After the results achieved on the southern Krasnogorovka south of the railway. Well, let's see how it all ends. Then we are moving with you to the Novomikhailovsky direction. A frame is published here. The Russian army has begun the final stage of the assault on the southern fortified area. Now, if we look at the black lines, it's possible that not all of the supports have been added here, of course, but in general. This is how the network of strongholds of the armed forces of Ukraine looks like in this direction. It is the defense from the south, the southwestern part. And now the Russian army is storming this line. It is applied as artillery strikes. Here we see this network of supports. Here are the frames from this particular angle. Well, pay attention. Here before your eyes, is the eastern part of Novomikhailovka. That's it. Well, it's just hot here. It's just hot in here. Bathhouse, which is not the most kind. The World Championship in the bath sport. The maximum possible fire damage is inflicted. And by the way, the first shots of assault attempts by the Russian army are already being published today. Paratroopers and stormtroopers under cover under artillery strikes storm the advanced positions high, then the fighters retreat. In general, the fighting is very complex because they are constantly being hit by cassettes. A huge number of these birds are flying. Drones are flying. Here is the westernmost, let's say, suburb of Novomikhailovka. An attempt to counterattack fighters in USU. Here it is possible that these geolocations are already confirmed by the control of this forest belt by the Russian army. In these frames, we watched how Max Proshka, empty from the point of view of armor, arrived at the front line. The troops landed. The defenders began to clean up, possibly counterattacking the Russian opposition. Max Proshka did not stand for a long time, and now an anti-tank is flying. Everything, Max Proshka remained in place. The AFU fighters no longer have the opportunity to evacuate, except on foot. But it may not work on foot, since drones are constantly flying here. In other words, there is an extremely high probability. This geolocation confirms that during the assault actions of the Russian army, it was possible to finally or maximally come close to Novomikhailovka along this forest belt. And here now there are attempts to consolidate, repel a counterattack. Well, we will observe. Well, again, I repeat, the main idea is that we are approaching the final battle for Novomikhailovka, and then, of course, Konstantinovka will begin without stopping. Then we are moving with you to the southern direction. Today, there is a slight activation of drones in Beer and strikes with the use of FABs on, let's say, Vostokno Eurozodny resumed again. The cassette arrives from Arbsi, the 500th arrives, but I remind you that there was some activity on the southern outskirts. But then it became maximum, and now no fighting is being carried out. Of the interesting things, it is worth paying attention to the Robin. Today, for the first time, probably, since the beginning of a special military operation, in addition to the Lumers, FABs have flown along the Robin. Usually, if we speak, we hear the word Robin, then of course, personally, I associate this item primarily with Lumers. And today the FABs flew. Perhaps in the near future, the Russian army, including in addition to the Lumers, FABs, and in the case of the disembodied, will begin some possible operations on the ground with the use of infantry. Then we move with you at work on no information, no updates here. Yes, perhaps then, in general, nothing has happened here in the last 24 hours. Like Foles, there is little activity. In general, as if nothing else. Of the interesting things that I would like to pay attention to, of course, is that, on the whole, we see with you that the front is slowly collapsing. Especially and clearly we can observe this with you on the Okrutinsky, that is, the Pokrovsky direction. And here, pay attention, as soon as the front cracked, and did not even crack, only plaster and whitewash began to fall from this front line. Pay attention to how the Western partners, to be more precise, the United States of America, immediately began to behave. And here, of course, the circus begins. A circus that you and I will watch for a long time, and discuss for a very long time, and maybe even laugh. What's going on? As soon as the plaster fell down, let's say from the front along the Avdiivka-Sharatina line, immediately in the White House, in the US Senate, they started talking about another package of military assistance, and so that they almost found consensus, found agreements. We coordinate everything, we sign everything. $61 billion, $23 billion will remain in the United States, that is, in fact. The producers will remain with the producers, who again may occur, perhaps then be sent to Ukraine, or restore their own losses of some kind. We have already found some kind of agreement, let's say, between Democrats and Republicans. Mike Johnson, I'm already putting everything to the vote. Tomorrow there will be voting in one chamber, next week in another. And there is an extremely high, let's say, probability that everyone, both chambers of Parliament, will vote for and give the green light to start supplying and delivering military aid to the USU, therefore a sufficiently large amount of money. But there is one very important nuance here. Of course, the United States is not only Democrats, Republicans, not only the Senate. There are a large number of, say, state institutions there. And then the most important question arose, which is that the deadlines are short, that is, you need to do one thing in another. Then you need to sign some new documents with Zelensky, and because now the help will not be given free of charge, in the form of loans. And here the question arises, will any of the US legislators have time to sign the Zelensky documents before the 20th or the 21st of May? Because after the 21st of May, Zelensky is officially no longer president. And his signature? Well, of course, let's just say it's a matter of taste. Yes, we admit, we sign, we will demand, right? But if Zelensky? Well, these are very high risks. Let's say that if he does not have time to prepare all the documentation by the same May 25th, then on May 26th, the illegitimate Zelensky will, in fact, sign documents for $61 billion. There is an extremely high probability that no one will ever confirm them at all. And the US Treasury has already raised this issue. They said that we will not allow the signing of documents from Ukraine. You will make any deal worth at least $1 trillion, coordinate it with all the chambers of Parliament. We will close the finance ministry, block the deal due to the fact that the signature must be signed by the legitimate president of Ukraine, one whose duty will never be disputed by anyone at all, and up to even never by anyone at all. And so here again the questions arise, how to do it. Either the 21st of May has time, or Zelensky holds elections. If Zelensky leads and goes to the polls, we are well aware that this story will never, ever end. Although some sources of the newspaper write, Sky News, let's assume that Ukraine just needs to hold out until the end of the year. Let's say Vice Chancellor Robert Habeck also arrived on the territory of Ukraine. Most likely they are discussing the transfer of equipment there. And the transfer of the same Aristi system that they promised to transfer. Well, as if such a story. Well, in general, the situation is very unpleasant, very difficult. And it will only get harder and only more difficult in the future. But, of course, despite the fact that they promised that they would give, the Russian authorities have already reacted to this situation, saying that in general, let's, if you want, let's. But in general, no matter how, it will not change the situation on earth. And Alexander Grigoryevich Lukashenko, including, in addition, confirmed Putin's words, and in our thoughts, that on the 21st day, Zelensky's legitimacy ends, and then, as if we personally say Belarus Russia of the Union State, we do not recognize a single signature, which was signed. Regardless of how the conflicts and the whole situation in Ukraine will end.